Earlier this week, the Biden administration approved one of the largest oil developments on federal land, a decision that came after months of intense lobbying and over objections that the project, known as Willow, would undermine U.S. efforts to phase out fossil fuels worldwide. According to an article on the Washington Post, for weeks, this Alaskan oil development, more than 4,000 miles from the White House, became central to the country's debate over climate change. The Washington Post article says it captivated activists and young people who united on social media to try to stop it. For Alaskan leaders and some of its residents, it was the most important federal decision facing their state in a long time, with many arguing for it as an economic boon. Oil industry leaders said it was key to their future relationship with President Biden. So what truly is the Willow project, and why has it caused so much controversy? Those questions and more regarding the climate crisis will get answered right now on Real Talk. Today, I am joined by guests Jillian Lane, adjunct instructor, Department of Sociology, Dr. Soltis, a professor in the Department of Physics and Earth Space Science, Dr. Sweets, UIndy professor of Ecology and Environmental Science classes, and McCaitlin Lawson, president of the UIndy Sustainability Club. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Willow is now the biggest oil project under consideration in the country, according to consulting firm Wood Mackenzie. ConocoPhillips estimate its cost at $8 to $10 billion. That has almost made it a top priority for climate activists, as they are pushing to reduce fossil fuel consumption as a way to cut the emissions that cause climate change, and have tried to stop major investments like this as a way to push away from oil. This project is especially vulnerable to public intervention because it's on federal lands and therefore requires federal permits to go forward. And Biden had promised to end new oil drilling on federal land. ConocoPhillips has held leases to develop oil for the region since the late 1990s and discovered Willow with 2 exploratory wells drilled in 2016. After roughly 5 years of permitting and legal fights, the Biden administration has approved the project to have as many as 3 drilling sites with up to 199 total wells. It shrunk the project from the 5 pads that ConocoPhillips had originally proposed following recommendations from a government review to keep development out of a yellow-billed loon nesting site and caribou migration paths. This has obviously made for an extremely controversial plan. What do you see as some of the outcome of this, Professor Lane?
Well, I think one of the things that I immediately thought about or asked myself, the lens that I kind of bring to this conversation is the human element to that, but also my background is also looking at social movements. So I think one of the things that I think about as we think about the advocacy efforts and we think about the environmental activists out there, the question I ask myself is, we think about the environmental movement as being very broad sweeping, and I think we talked earlier about, it should be an issue that's important to everyone, but I think it's important to also, the question I ask myself is how are we amplifying the voices that are going to be immediately affected in that community. We all know that Alaska is native lands and there are still a lot of native and indigenous populations there, and so I think that was the largest question I asked myself, like where is that voice and how are those communities be particularly affected, because we know that sure this will affect climate change on a much broader scale, but thinking about those people in the immediate community I think is also important. Mm-hmm. So again, I kind of have that like micro view sometimes, but as I heard about the evolution of the project and the evolution of kind of the news story that's happening, that was a question that I felt like I asked myself and had a lot of curiosity around. I know that there are advocates out there doing the work, but I wonder how we can bring that to the forefront.
Absolutely, and we're definitely going to get into some of those voices that we need to hear that are going to be affected directly. I'm interested to hear from the rest of you as well, what your initial thoughts on the project are.
Well, I would say my initial thought is that I wonder if it's actually going to happen, because the North Slope of Alaska has been a political football for many, many years, starting with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is just to the east of the National Petroleum Reserve. And so I wonder, first of all, because these things are going back and forth for years. You know, I mean, the Republican administration will say, open up the leases. Democrats say, don't. This happened just recently. The Trump administration opened up leases. Very few companies even wanted to get the leases from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and Biden closed them down again. So it'll be interesting to see if it actually happens in the future to some degree. So that's the first thing I think about. What are the outcomes? Well, we'll see, because there will be lots of legal challenges.
Yeah. Dr. Soltis.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the timing, because just the other day, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, released their most recent report, which is a heavily scientifically peer-reviewed document. It's done through multiple government agencies. It's basically the bottom line when it comes to climate, and they're really big on communicating what they found and making it accessible. And one of the biggest things they found, and I'll use this analogy of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, kind of like water in a swimming pool. So you have an above ground swimming pool full of water, there's a hose going into it pumping water and a drain that's clogged. To deal with where we are with climate change right now, we need to get that hose turned off as soon as possible, we need to get the drain unclogged, and we need to learn how to swim and teach everyone else how to swim. So what we mean by that is we need to drastically cut carbon emissions. That's turning the hose off, which is not like flipping a switch, right? We're not there. We can't do that yet. We need to unclog the drain. We need to look at ways that we can sequester or store this carbon, which again, the technology is not quite there yet. And the most important is learning to swim, right? We need to learn how to deal with this changing climate, and also what Professor Lane was saying, help others learn how to swim too, because the effects of climate change are not equally spread. It's very much an environmental justice issue. So the timing could not be better, right? We have this Willow project announced and this IPCC report, and we have two very contrasting things. So it's one of those things in environmental science you have all the time where there is not an easy answer. No one can say, I have the solution. It's rather a very complex issue that we have to really look at from a variety of lenses.
Absolutely, and I think as we've seen, it's very hard to reach some of that middle ground, and so that's something we're also going to talk about today. When we discuss potential effects of Willow, the statistics are pretty intimidating. The Bureau of Land Management estimates that Willow could produce 576 million barrels of oil over 30 years. Initial gravel mining and road construction work has already started for this development, which will have a total footprint of 499 acres, according to the administration's final decision. For comparison, that is 2.5 times the area the Washington Commanders recently acquired to build a new football stadium. Burning Willow's oil would also put into the atmosphere an estimated 239 million metric tons of carbon dioxide during the project's 30-year lifetime, or the equivalent of driving 1.7 million gasoline-powered cars a year. Under estimates from the Biden administration, even if Willow doesn't get built, the United States and the rest of the world will still burn a large amount of fossil fuels. So cleaner options, the estimate said, would only account for roughly half of the energy demand that Willow would have met. Willow going forward would create about 70 million metric tons of additional CO2 from the project in US emissions, and another 60 million tons internationally, equivalent to just 0.03% of US emissions in 2021, according to those same estimates. That's a lot of information, and it's a lot to try to grasp. From a sociological standpoint, just as you were discussing earlier, how it's important to hear some of those voices that are going to be more directly affected. Does Willow have the potential to disturb our day-to-day lives, and specifically the Alaskans? And we'll start there.
Well, I think, again, kind of going to my previous comment around, indigenous populations and the reliance on the land itself, it will obviously be compromised. But I think for me, like the human element here as well is it's reconfirming to me the importance that our government is placing on oil or non-renewable sources. And so to me, I just think that sends a very strong message, not just locally, but nationally and even globally. So I think that's the thing that I think about in this scenario when we think about how it's going to impact people. To me, it's reconfirming that we're going to continue down this path. And it makes me wonder what the alternatives will be, or is there some kind of counter plan here? I think that's a question that I ask myself, and that I wonder, how does this set the standard going forward as well?
Yeah. Michaelan, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what you see as potentially the daily life from a sustainability standpoint as well.
I think it's hard to say at this point for the rest of the country. I think there definitely wouldn't be as much impact on like the general public as there would be for the people that's directly impacting in that area. But I think most people are concerned with the use of that land and how it impacts the people that are living there, as well as the species that migrate through there. I've heard of some things with like the caribou migration, how that's going to impact them by using that land for the project, as well as the emissions, like you were saying. The US producing more pollutants in our air than we have in the past. But I think I was just curious of how that actually compares to other oil projects that are already in place, like how that compares to ones that are happening overseas when we are importing oil from, say, Saudi Arabia or Iran. When you use those statistics, I'm just curious of if it's about that same level for other projects, or if it would actually be more from other ones, since the oil is being imported. Do any other professors have?
Well, it's a very large project, but as Hannah said, if you look at a percentage basis, it's not very much. But as Dr. Soltis just pointed out a while ago, you can make that argument for every project. Every project is going to contribute a very small percentage to the total. But unfortunately, to meet the IPCC's guidelines and hopes for the future, so we don't go above 2 degrees total warming by 2050 or afterwards, or even 1.5, which is looking less and less like we're going to get there. Well, not going to stop there, rather, we're going to go past there. You have to actually stop. You have to actually replace fossil fuels with green sources. You can't just keep producing it. That's not going to do it. You know, net zero is one thing, but you have to actually turn off the hose. That's the hard part. So every little bit means you haven't turned off the hose. You just opened it up a little bit wider.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's important to recognize that some people think, well, it's a switch that needs pushed just to go from fossil fuels to renewable, and it's not. We're not there. So to kind of you know, when they made this announcement, I was surprised at first to hear that the Biden administration was doing this. When I looked more at the story, I forgot how complex this is. Everything with energy is always so complex. These leases were already there, and had the Biden administration shut this down, they would have opened themselves up to legal challenges, fines. So some have argued that this was the best option because maybe now the environmental groups can get it shut down, if that's the goal. Right. On the flip side, as you mentioned, Hannah, you know, there are economic benefits, and Caitlin kind of mentioned this too, where, you know, if the oil's not coming from Alaska, where is it coming from? Saudi Arabia, Russia, right? And so with the conflict in Ukraine, this discussion of energy independence has really come out there, and what's ready to go is the oil, the natural gas. Unfortunately, as much as we'd love it to be, it is not the wind yet, it is not the solar yet. But there is a lot of hope that it could be someday. I know we're going to get into the politics about this a little bit, but like with climate change, we talk about a lot about individual action, but the IPCC is also very clear that a lot of it is going to come to political structural change. So though politics is a challenge, ultimately, one way or the other, if our hand is forced or not, it's going to have to be the solution someday as well to get that large-scale structural change.
Right, because, you know, when you look at how legislation is made, it's obvious politics is completely necessary. And, you know, some of those more financial and economical things, we want to look at those too. How could this impact gas prices? Because, you know, like you said, if we're not getting oil from the United States, it's coming from somewhere. So if we have the oil on U.S. soil, is that going to be better for us economically? And does that outweigh the potential harmful effects of this project? I'm curious.
Or is it better for Biden politically in the next election is the real question. Is it better internationally with the threat in Ukraine, and our European allies have to have some assurance that they can get their fossil fuels they need from other sources? And in some ways, you know, the actual crisis in Ukraine has caused Europe to move much more quickly toward a green economy than they would have imagined 18 months ago. So sometimes these kinds of things can open up opportunities that we don't see otherwise. But You know, ultimately, as you're talking about the business, I mean, the largest oil production in the world in Saudi Arabia, they made $180 billion last year. That's $180 billion. If there's that kind of money to be made, then that's always going to talk very, very loudly. I mean, that's why Lisa Murkowski, the Democratic senator from Alaska, she's pushing this all the way through.
And that's one of the things I was thinking in some of your previous comments was, you know, especially with inflation, you know, Americans are struggling. It's not easy to, you know, have all the amenities and to do all the fun stuff that families used to do. So gas prices are really vital, especially for those, you know, in our lower income brackets and our communities of color. And so I think it's really important to recognize too that, you know, there's a push-pull there for just the American citizen as well. And I think the promise of lower gas prices is really desirable for some folks. And so, you know, there's that kind of negotiation that I think Americans are having as voters as well, or I would imagine, you know.
Absolutely, and kind of to add to that and what Dr. Sweets mentioned about political calculations is something people don't always realize is just because we are extracting the oil, it does not magically turn into gasoline right away, right? So it's going to be, when you talk about political gambles, something that will not be paying off until years down the road. The construction on the North Slope of Alaska is a little bit tenuous, a little bit tricky. It actually, they have to do it in the winter because it relies on ice roads. If you watch like Ice Road Truckers, like that's the situation, right? So it's not going to be an immediate payoff. And Americans, just like anyone else, we're a little impatient sometimes, and sometimes our political memory is quite short. So in the short term, it's not going to have much of an impact on gas prices. By the time it does, you know, who knows what's going to be going on now, what issues are on the forefront of the minds of other, you know, Americans and people who in a very short amount of time will be voting again for the politics that they see as getting them out of, you know, wherever we are right now. So there's a lot of calculating, there's a lot of weighing both sides, and also, you know, just the fact that we don't know what's going to happen next, right? So this is the issue right now, and it has the potential to be a huge issue down the road, but how long will it stay on the public memory?
But we do know one thing is going to happen next, and that is that we're 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial, and it'll be 1.2, and it'll be 1.3, it'll be 1, and we know what's going to happen with high confidence because of that.
I want to kind of broaden this a little bit out beyond just the Willow project and just to climate change in general. I want to try to see if we can find some sort of middle ground. You know, obviously it would be naive to say that we could all just, you know, snap our fingers and all be driving electric tomorrow, for example. So I'm just curious, as we look at these other sources of energy, you know, we'll use what I just said, the driving electric, for example. How are batteries different, or are they better, or are they worse for the environment than oil, for example? Because it's my understanding you cannot recycle batteries. So I'm just curious how some of these supposed sustainable resources that, you know, we are hopefully looking to as alternatives, are they going to be any better for the environment?
Well, as I've taught Caitlin before, she knows this, there are sources and sinks for everything that we do. So when you think about the sources of those batteries, those are lithium mines in Bolivia that maybe are not being managed the way we would like, another sociological issue, right? And they are the sinks of what we're going to do with them afterwards. So it's not necessarily a totally clean solution. There is nothing that's a totally clean solution. Plus, when you plug your Tesla into the Tesla charger, where's the electricity coming from?
Right.
Is it coming from green sources, or is it coming from natural gas? Is it coming from oil, or maybe even coal?
Yeah.
And so that becomes a real problem. I think when you think about it that way, nothing is going to be perfect, especially when you're still generating electricity in ways that are not carbon neutral.
I was going to add that, I mean, I think that's an important thing that I talk about with my students too, right? Like, recycling is great, but it takes energy to recycle things. And like, so I think you have to really think about the way things are produced from point A to point Z and what happens to them after. Like, there's so many different elements that come into play that are usually energy producing at some capacity. So, I mean, again, it's just such a complex issue, and it's not, again, I think one of the challenges I think that the general American kind of has is that I can drive my electric car, but like, how am I really making a global difference, because it is a global issue? So I think there's that challenge too. It feels like I don't really have an impact as an individual, and it kind of goes back to your comment about policy, but it's such a spectrum of issues that lie within one issue that I think it can be really challenging to unpack all of that, and especially for the average person to unpack all of that too.
Absolutely. Michaela, I know we were talking a little bit before this about your conversation with the solar panels, and I think that is extremely prevalent now.
Yeah, so last year in 2022, I went to the Renewable Energy Day that was being hosted at the Indiana State House, and I was able to talk with some different companies and organizations about what they are trying to do in their programs to better the environment, whether it be in Indiana or across the nation. And I was able to talk with a solar company that I was curious about the process of solar panels on homes and all the things that go into that. And then I asked the representative there what they're able to do about solar panels at end of life. And he just had to be honest with me, and he was like, we can't recycle them yet. Like, we don't have a proper way of disposing of those materials. So that was kind of discouraging, but not completely surprising to hear. It's just where we are at this point. Hopefully there can be those programs in the future to do recycling. And it's nice to know that we are looking for those alternatives, whether it be solar or wind or nuclear, in addition to oil, but I don't think it's as simple as making that full transition at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously completely understandable. As we were saying, nothing happens overnight. But we talk a lot about the future. What is the future? You know, obviously we're talking solar, wind, things like that. When can we hopefully see these things happen? And with that, you know, we're talking, we are told all the time is of the essence, time is running out. Are we going to get to that point before it's too late?
Right, so that's a great question. And really, human innovation can do great things. Like, our species name is Homo sapiens, wise man. We've gotten ourselves out of a lot of tight spots before. For example, the invention of the Haber-Bosch process that allowed us to take atmospheric nitrogen and use it for fertilizer revolutionized agriculture. But if you can see Dr. Sweets over here, he's shaking his head. There were major ramifications of that, right? The Earth is a complex system, so one small change can cause many, many other changes, and it's not linear. There's lots of feedbacks. So it's hard to say. There's a lot of promising technology, but a lot of it is limited by the funding and the resources put into it, right? To do science, you need to do the research. You need to do it correctly. But it was interesting, as you were mentioning finding common ground earlier, we actually have found renewables as a way to find common ground. For example, the wind industry in Kansas, traditionally conservative state, which if we have to, you know, put people into groups, usually we see more conservative states not being as friendly to these renewable policies, sustainable policies, but Kansas has had great success with their wind industry because of the economic boom that came along with it, right? There are a lot of benefits of going renewable that sometimes are not always clear to people, but we have seen that as an ability to find middle ground because, like Professor Lane said, we are looking for, you know, ways to make money. Like, we want to make sure our families are taken care of. We're looking for jobs. And green industry, green energy has the power to do that, right? So the more that we lean into that, the more we can build bridges, right, between different groups. There's been a lot of really interesting research done on how people have different backgrounds, and that can include political spectrum, religious beliefs, how they deal with climate change, how they process that. But when we look at these kind of like kitchen table issues, jobs, money, there's opportunity, and green energy, and some of these shifts we need to make that the IPCC recommends actually can have great economic benefit. So it's about exposing people to that, and also I think it's really about people realizing, and Caitlin mentioned this when we were talking earlier, that it's not environmental issues are not Republican or Democrat issues. We all share one environment. We all share one planet. These issues affect all of us regardless of politically where we land, right? So it's an issue, I think, a lot of with the future of renewable and green energy. It's really about how we can build those bridges and how we can find middle ground and help people see the benefits of this.
Absolutely. You know, obviously we're on UND's campus. I want to bring this closer to home. And I'm fortunate to have Caitlin here. So as the president of the Sustainability Club, what advice do you have to other students to get us to be informed and be able to do the small things that we can here on campus?
So I think some of the things you and I were talking about earlier is different programs that we can implement on the university. We were sort of discussing how the university hasn't done the greatest job with their recycling program, but there are reasons for that. Like they have had to keep it more on the down low or not have it as public to all of the students because students don't completely know how to recycle properly. And that's not entirely their fault. I guess it's not entirely anyone's fault, but it would be great if schools did a better job of teaching students from a younger age, like how to do recycling properly. You know, you learn the 3 R's, you learn reduce, reuse, recycle, and then they just say you recycle plastic, paper, glass, but they don't really go into the specifics of what that actually needs to look like, how they are supposed to be cleaning those containers properly, making sure that they are cleaned and dried before recycling because the programs aren't always able to do that. So it would be really great if our campus was able to do a better job of that. Me as a leader for the Sustainability Club, if we were able to implement possibly a program like that where we do like pre-recycling, able to take in those recyclable materials that students have and make sure that they are being processed properly before they actually go on to waste management, raise recycling. Just so there isn't that contamination that has continued to be a problem up to this point.
Absolutely. I definitely think that there's a lack of information and education when it comes to recycling, and I think that that could be a huge stepping stone, is getting people to know what the actual parameters are for being able to recycle. Because in our conversation earlier, I had no idea that you had to clean out and dry all of the cans that you're recycling, all of those things. I had no idea. So probably like 90% of the things that I've tried to recycle in my life have just been thrown away. And that's a scary reality because I'm sure I'm not the only one, you know? And so being able to discuss those things and have those things put out to students, faculty, all of that, I think we can all do a better job of that. So it seems like I believe in grassroots change, you know, starting small, working out as you can. What are some things that, other than just recycling, if you have any ideas that we can do in simple day-to-day improvements here on campus or at home?
Well, bringing it back to energy and oil and the resources that people are using in their own lives as consumers, I really like the idea of reduction and, you know, just being more intentional about those resources that we're using, whether it be making that transition from driving everywhere to trying to use like public transit, or Indianapolis is a pretty good city for, you know, easily being able to cycle or walk, and I know that that's not easy for everyone to do, but it could be a step in the right direction if it's, you know, if people are able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure that obviously you are available to the other students and able to get involved in the Sustainability Club. Just real quickly, could you kind of plug your, I don't know if you have social media or anything like that, how can students on campus get involved in the Sustainability Club?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a Instagram page, which is at UND Sustain, and we meet every other Wednesday at 9 p.m. in Martin Hall, room 150. We actually have a meeting tonight if anyone is interested. And we have a couple events that are coming up in April. April 5th, it will be a Wednesday at 7 p.m. We are going to be having a paper making event. I'm providing the materials, the tools that we are going to be using. They're called decals. And we're going to be doing a water process to make new sheets of paper from recycled or old sheets of paper. So that will be our first one. And then we also have the Earth Day Palooza that we host every April before Earth Day. And there's a few different RSOs that are involved in that. In the past, we've had Circle K, Glamour Gals, Food Recovery Network, and the Sustainability Club involved to have a multitude of sustainable activities and crafts. In the past, Glamour Gals had their clothing swap, and we did some crafts of like making reusable bags from like old clothing, and then this year, I think we're going to be trying to do like a trash pickup day on the day of the Earth Day Palooza, as well as trying to do those crafts as well. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that I was able to have all of you on, and I really appreciate you being here and starting this very important conversation. I'm your host, Haerle. Join me next Wednesday for another conversation like this. This is Real Talk.